Let's give a warm, caffeinated welcome to Alexandra Israel from the Toronto Zoo, where she's a wildlife biologist. This is green button, red button back. You can use either mic.
Hello. Hello, I'm Alex. I'm a research lead for the Toronto Zoo, and I'm going to talk today about the project that I'm leading and the fieldwork that we did this past summer. Soon. To be determined. I can see it, so that's most important, I think. Did everyone have a good night?
Comedy.
Oh, comedy is definitely not my thing. I leave that to Toby for the team and Eric for his bad dad jokes. Anybody else have any jokes? Everyone enjoying the conference? This is my first bat conference, so that's exciting. Little browns, that's what I'm talking about today. But I think my most favorite bat is probably the hoary bat. I follow the Pennsylvania Bat Rescue, and their videos of feeding bats bring me a lot of joy every day. Highly recommend. Big brown, obvious, of course. Oh my goodness, all right. So I'm going to be talking about my project on little browns today. So just to start off, I kind of wanted to start off a bit broad and talk about what's required for suitable summer habitat for breeding bats. And probably one of the most important things is having safe roosting sites. And that's because safe roosting sites provide breeding bats with protection from inclement weather, from predators, it also provides them a place to have their pups safely and raise them, and it also gives them an opportunity to participate in social interactions with one another. And as we know, a lot of our species in Ontario will use pre-existing human-made structures to roost in, so like our big brown bats and little brown bats, and that's because these structures often provide ideal thermal properties like warmer climates and more stable climates. And also, we see a lot of species have high site fidelity to their roosting sites. And so this means they will return year after year to the same structure to form their maternity colonies. And so not only roosting sites are important for suitable summer habitat, but good foraging areas are also really important for suitable summer habitat. And so what I mean is sites that have wetlands, marshes, waterways, streams, rivers, basically areas that can provide an abundance of insect prey for foraging bats. And when we're speaking in the context of an agricultural landscape, these two are probably quite limited. And so as we know, agriculture is expanding globally, and agricultural intensification refers to the conversion of natural environments, so like forests and wetlands, and converting these natural environments into agricultural landscapes. And not only do we have to consider the loss of habitat, we also have to consider that there's going to be increased use of pesticides in these landscapes, which directly affects insect abundance. And so with that in mind, that brings me to my study species. As I mentioned before, the little brown Myotis. As we heard a lot yesterday, the species used to be one of the most abundant throughout North America, but they have declined severely due to white nose syndrome. and so they are listed as endangered. A lot of studies have looked at the roosting behavior of little brown Myotis. Some studies have shown that colonies are very loyal to their roosting sites and will return year after year. But some studies have shown that they don't have as much high roost site fidelity and will switch roosts throughout the summer season. So there's quite a bit of variation. And quite a few studies have quantified the foraging behavior of little brown Myotis, and some have found, again, contrasting results where some will travel quite far to their foraging grounds, up to several kilometers. But some studies have shown that little brown Myotis colonies will remain relatively close to their roosting sites when foraging. So because of all this variation, even within one species, this makes them quite a compelling study system. Okay, so this brings me to my study site, which consists of 2 large livestock barns in southwestern Ontario, which is a heavily farmed area. And we conducted our own emergence counts at these barns this past summer, and between the 2 barns, there's nearly 600 bats, which is quite a substantial number of little brown Myotis, an endangered species in Ontario. So clearly the site is very important for this colony. Now, so sort of our largest question for this site is, what are these bats doing? Where are they going? What are they doing? So we hypothesized that they would probably be, since it is in an agricultural area, as you'd expect, there are lots of barns. So we kind of predicted that they would likely be switching roosts throughout the area, but there is a large river near the barns, and so we kind of predicted that they would be foraging more locally in this area because we suspect that this would provide a lot of insects. And so this brings me to our methods. We trapped bats at these barns this summer. We caught a total of 24 total of 24 bats. Most were adult females, as you'd expect. We took biometric measurements. Most importantly, we admired how cute they were, and we put radio tags on 5 individual bats, following standard procedure, and we tracked them in the daytime and the nighttime to determine their daytime maternity roosts and their relative foraging areas. So essentially what we found was the bats that we trapped at each barn returned to those barns. So these 4 bats that we radio tagged at barn 1 returned to roost in barn 1, and the 1 bat that we trapped at barn 2 returned to roost in barn 2. However, one of our bats with tag 501 did some very interesting things. So here's a map of the study site, and you can see this river that I was talking about north of the barns. There's barn 1 and barn 2 by the yellow pentagrams. And then you can see that there's a new barn highlighted in blue. And that's because we radio tracked this bat to this new barn, which was very exciting. This was a spot that we hadn't known that bats were roosting in yet in this area. And then there was also a 3rd unknown roost that we didn't know where she was staying in. So, and then this new barn is about 700 meters from the primary barn location. And so this is sort of a timeline that shows you where this bat was going each day, because she roosted in a different spot each day compared to the other bats. And so the first day that we tracked her, she was actually in the new barn location, and then she returned to barn 1 the next day. And then on the 3rd day, I had thought her tag had fallen off, her tag stopped working. I was like, oh great, we only got 3 days. But turns out she had returned to barn 1 the following day. The day after that, she had roosted in the new barn, and then we were unable to find her again, so the tag had probably fallen off in a location that we couldn't detect. So that was quite interesting. And then, bear with me. Okay, so going to our foraging results, you can see all these polygons are sort of color-coded to the individual bat IDs here. And so you can see that we generated these polygons with essentially detections where we found the bats while driving around these roads at night, and also on properties that we had access to walk around on foot as well. And we sort of generated these by creating a buffer around each of our GPS points based on the signal strength of our receiver to sort of get an idea of how far the bats were from us when we detected them. And so you can see tag 505 stayed relatively around the main barn area, very small foraging area. 504 sort of ventured a bit more east, but still stayed relatively close. Tag 501 kind of went a bit further west, and you can see that that was the bat who was using the blue barn to roost in, so perhaps she was doing this to reduce her commuting time between her preferred foraging area. But what I like to notice about this is that all the polygons do overlap over top of the river, so the river is probably a very important foraging area for this colony. So you'll notice that one of the bats was not listed on there, well, two of them. Tag 503 unfortunately fell off or stopped working very quickly, so we didn't really get much data from her. But tag 502, we couldn't detect her foraging any night. It was so frustrating, like she'd be in the roost and then she'd be gone. And we didn't know where she was going. And then we looked at the Myotis data, and she was actually detected by a Myotis tower that's about 20 kilometers away from the main barn site, which was quite interesting. And so this red line is the buffer of the Myotis tower, and so the buffer is actually only about 5 kilometers from the roosting site. So she traveled a minimum of 5 kilometers from the site, but we don't, there's no way to know exactly where she's going. In the middle there is a marshy swamp area, so it's possible she was commuting there to forage, but this was on 3 separate nights, so it's quite interesting that this one individual bat was traveling so far to her foraging grounds. All right, so what does this tell us? Well, we definitely showed evidence that there's variation in roost site selection and foraging area, even within the same colony. Although this isn't entirely groundbreaking, it does, contribute to our growing knowledge of this threatened species in Ontario and Canada, and hopefully this information can be used in the future towards future conservation efforts for this declining species. So I think that's about all I had to share today. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who helped with my project, particularly Chloe, who spent the entire time with me at the site, and to the rest of the Toronto Zoo team. And I know that Eric was there in spirit. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Did we have any questions? Oh, making me go all the way to the other side.
Perhaps I missed this, but what was the reproductive status of these bats? Were they lactating or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we trapped them in early July. So this was after young revolant. So we had trapped juveniles as well, a few in the harp traps.
So they didn't have to return to young at that point?
No, they didn't have to return to young at that point.
Does that mean they were all female bats?
Most of the bats we trapped were females, but we did get a few juvenile males, and we also got one adult breeding male, which was, well, not breeding male, but one adult male, which was quite interesting.
Sorry, and those trapped bats.
Oh, the tracked bats are all adult females, yes.
Do we know if that new roost site was being used by other members of the colony, or if it was a mixed colony roost site?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough staff to do an emergence count at that site, but that's definitely something that we would like to do in our upcoming field season.
With the overlap in their foraging areas, I noticed you were mentioning there was the overlap in the river. The map showed that it was only overlapping in like one specific little section of the river. Do you know if there was anything special about that specific area, or was it just like that's where it happened to be?
It could be because it's sort of in closest proximity to the barn site, but I don't think there's anything particularly special about that part of the river compared to the rest of it.
I'm curious what the available roosting sites in the nearby area are, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of situations where bats will use a network of roosts, which is what we were finding with our tracking work in Ottawa here. And so we found bats were using a multiple number of roosts and switching quite often, but this shows they're pretty loyal to those 2 barns.
Yeah.
Is there a lack of other roosts potentially in the area?
There are a lot of barns in the area, which is why we thought we would see more roost switching, and a lot of older houses in the area that would be ideal roosting sites. I was surprised to see how loyal they were to their 2 barns, and I was surprised that even of the 5 bats that we had tagged, there was no switching between the barns as well, because I kind of expected that. Yeah.
I'm going to get my steps in.
So forgive me, I'm not exactly a super bat knowledge person, but of all the females that you tagged, do you know how many of them had actually like had a pup that summer? And if that one female that you didn't, you found like was switching among the roosts, if they didn't have a pup that summer, if that might have accounted for the ability to kind of move more?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we were sort of reaching the part where it was really hard to tell, at least the time of year where it was really hard to tell if they were still lactating. So I know in our notes there was a lot of question marks around that. So we weren't totally sure if all of them had pups.
No more questions? Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you.